Yes, the burning of Moscow was especially Russian, my friend. Of that there can be no doubt, because it was not a discrete event. It was the form of an event, one example plucked from a history of thousands. For as a people, we Russians have proven unusually adept at destroying that which we have created. Perhaps. The fall of France did not begin at the end of the Russian campaign, as Napoleon and the Grand Armée began to do a large withdrawal from Russia. Instead, it began when the French army entered Moscow on September 14th, 1812, and what occurred that evening. But the burning of Moscow does not begin simply at the French army entry into the Holy Russian capital. Instead, it begins on June 24th, 1812, on the shores of the Niemen River. Following Russia not agreeing to aid France during the war in Spain, and also because Russia continued to trade with England, which went against Napoleon's continental system. The continental system was Napoleon's solution to Great Britain, being he could not defeat the Royal Navy, he hoped he could defeat them by a trade embargo. However, Portugal and Russia had chosen to continue trade, which led to the Iberian Peninsula War, and then led to the path of war with Russia. Now, Napoleon had intended to invade, destroy the Russian army, seize the capital and the Tsar, and establish a, so to speak, sister empire under the command of France. The Tsar, however, turned to one of his best commanders, Mikhail Kutuzov, for advice on how to handle the French invasion. Kutuzov was an old man, 67 years old, and blind in one eye. He had been serving for many years in the Imperial Army, serving since the time of Catherine the Great. But he was a student of Napoleon, being one of the only generals at Austerlitz to speak against attacking the French. He also studied Napoleon's logistical policies. Napoleon's Grand Armée survived on thin supply lines only because of his foraging system, in which the army would search the countrysides, pillaging and taking supplies for the army. At the time of the French invasion, the Tsar, under Kutuzov's advice, gave the scorched earth order. This was to leave nothing for the French. Though Napoleon was victorious, beating the Russian armies, he was just gaining destroyed land, not any supplies. On September 7th, 1814, Napoleon and Kutuzov would meet on the fields of Borodino, the bloodiest battle in the Napoleonic Wars. The Grand Armée entered with 135,000 men and would lose around 35,000 by the end of the fighting. The Russians would enter with 160,000 men, and it is believed to have lost over 50,000 men by the end of the day. Borodino was a French victory, but Kutuzov was not fighting to win. He was fighting to delay the French army. While Borodino was happening 70 miles away in Moscow, the imperial court and government were evacuating, and the Russian army was setting a surprise for Napoleon and his army. The Russian army abandoned Moscow, but before doing so, they had set the city with rags and oil cases set to explode, and men had been given orders to do it once the French army had settled. Napoleon then early on the 14th would enter Moscow, totally abandoned, except for a few civilians and so on. He would secure the city and begin to plan his next moves. Assuming that Tsar Alexander I had withdrawn to St. Petersburg. However, the night of the 14th, a handful of men, while the French slept, they lit those oil cases and rags on fire, engulfing the entire city. Napoleon, who had taken up residence inside the Kremlin, was awoken as the flames blazed and destroyed the city. He was horrified, but also impressed. As the flames raged, he would say, "What a terrible sight, and they did this to themselves. So many palaces, what an incredible solution. What kind of people? These Scythians." Napoleon withdrew from the Kremlin, taking up residence in the Petrovsky Palace, a little outside of Moscow, as the city continued to burn to the ground. The French army quickly attempted to put out the fires, but the Russians had, on their way out, destroyed the firefighting equipment, and with the heavy winds hitting, the fire would continue to rage. The French would fight the fire until the 18th of September, when the fire would finally end, and Moscow was almost completely destroyed. On the 18th, Napoleon returned to the Kremlin and announced he planned to keep the army in Moscow, believing, even in the state of destruction, that the city was a more viable option for housing the army. The French army also began to deliver reprisals, arresting thousands, and those being found guilty of being the arsonist being executed by firing squad. Napoleon had, however, also truly believed that with his capital captured, Tsar Alexander would negotiate. But those negotiations would not come. With the scorched earth policy, however, and the destruction of Moscow, the French army had become low on supplies and running out of options for survival. On October 19th, 1812, the not-so-Grand Armée began to withdraw from Moscow, beginning one of the worst retreats in the history of the world. The Russians would reoccupy Moscow, and the end of the French Empire would only be a little over a year away. The myth of the unconquerable Russia began, and the fact that Russia was willing to sacrifice their own capital was something remembered up until the fall of the reigns of the Tsar over 100 years later. Thanks for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like, share, and comment if you did. If new to the channel, please subscribe. And if you are returning and not yet subscribed, please subscribe. Thanks again, and we will see you in the next one.